should be live now. Very
Okay.
good. I'm just going to tweet out the link
All right.
momentarily. Um, Feel free to retweet it or not.
Yeah.
Only
Okay.
issue is, unfortunately, my system slows down slightly when I have the Hangout open, but
Okay.
should not be long now. Last time I remembered to set up the tweet prior to actually beginning the Hangout, and I didn't remember this time, so shame on me.
Oh well.
Um, okay, got the link. And for your information, I do always make sure to invite the losers and the haters,
All right.
so they may be joining it.
Fantastic.
They may be joining us.
Yeah.
And the link is now tweeted, or should be.
Okay. I'll have a look.
It is indeed. Okay,
Cool.
so let us begin. Um, well, something that's always kind of intrigued me, and it's something that's hard to um, get a handle on from my vantage point, is that foreign nations, let's say, especially those in the Anglosphere and others, always seem to have
Mm.
a relatively keen familiarity with what's going on in the United States, namely
Yeah.
the U.S. presidential campaign process, which is um, cartoonish and kind of outsized, even here. But it's always striking to see how aware of it and familiar with the people are elsewhere. I mean,
Mm.
how would you sort of summarize the degree to which you individually, and I guess the Australian media, as you perceive it, has focused on the current election, which is now nearing its climax?
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't paying attention to your election until the candidates were decided upon by the individual parties. So I didn't tune into the primary debates or anything like that. And I don't know that many Australians did. But since Clinton and Trump were the decided candidates, and since they've been having their debates, there's been a lot of media attention and a lot of discussion, and I suppose the attention. I mean, a lot of it is just simply to do with entertainment. It's entertaining to watch, but then there is the added seriousness that whatever you guys end up doing, particularly in terms of foreign policy and anything international, it does affect us to some extent. But I suppose the motivation is more abject or sort of morbid fascination, really, because it's such a divided country, such a great, powerful, important country, but so divided, and there's sort of just that abject, morbid fascination part of it.
Right, but thinking back to 2008, I mean, the ascendance of Obama was fairly widely um, followed,
Applauded,
right?
yeah, yeah,
Applauded,
yeah.
followed, and it was in the consciousness of many foreign countries, and Obama was, he received very high approval in a lot of places, and
Mm,
that was cited domestically as a reason
mm,
why Obama should actually win the 2008 election over John McCain, who was the Republican nominee, because he could restore America's image abroad, right? Because he was
mm.
seen as a sort of more cosmopolitan, worldly
Yeah.
figure and a sharp break from the kind of cowboy style of George W. Bush.
Mm.
So I don't know. And what was it? Was it just a facet, like a kind of celebrity watching game back then too, or what makes it morbid now? I mean, other than the spectacle of Trump, which maybe is the key reason, but what makes it morbid now as compared to, say, 2008 when Obama was on the rise?
Oh, well, I remember being quite interested in 2008 as well. So I suppose because Australia is a small country and our politics is extraordinarily tame compared to yours. It, it just watching the Republicans and the Democrats and the contest between those two parties is interesting in and of itself. In Australia, our parties are very centrist, they're very similar, and we don't have the ideological battles that you guys have. We have nothing like the Republican Party in Australia. We have a centre-right party, but the ideology is not comparable. So it's interesting as an Australian watching how the Democrats contend with the traditional Republican Party. And this time it's been extraordinarily interesting because Trump is not a Republican. I mean, he's not what you would consider from my perspective, he's completely different. And just watching how that unfolds is the interesting part of it.
Yeah, well, he's a Republican. I mean, he is just factually a Republican. He's a registered Republican. He's a Republican nominee. He's just not a conventional conservative, or at least he's not a movement conservative of the kind that has dominated the Republican Party coalition since the 80s. And actually, a game that's been played by Republicans for well over a year now, I guess, since he even began running in June 2015, is to kind of disingenuously claim that he's not of their ilk, right? So that they kind of get this sense of remove from him, as if nothing about the Republican Party coalition should be seen as culpable in giving rise to him, when obviously the way that the coalition is constituted did give rise to him. But something I'm interested from your vantage point is, given the fairly widespread awareness of American politics in Australia, at least relatively speaking, I mean, does that breed any kind of antipathy, or because Americans know extraordinarily little about Australian politics. I'm someone who's very well aware of politics generally, and although I have like I was telling you before, I have a cursory familiarity with Australian politics. I don't have anything like an authoritative kind of knowledge about it. I mean, I know a little bit about the parliamentary system, and there has been a somewhat rapid succession of prime ministers in recent years, and I know, but I couldn't comment with any kind of credibility. I don't feel on the intricacies of it. Whereas I feel like if you were to comment on some maybe intra-Republican Party dynamic or some intra-Democratic Party dynamic, you would have at least a decent level of awareness with such that you could actually comment intelligently. So there seems like there's a discrepancy there, and I'm wondering if that kind of directly or indirectly breeds any kind of underlying antipathy about the role of the United States plays on the world stage, as you kind of see it.
Yeah, look, I don't think it really does at the moment. I think Australians and people outside of America feel sorry for the election campaign that you guys have had to go through, and there is genuine concern about the levels of political polarization and division, but I wouldn't say there's any antipathy. And for Australians to take interest in political events that are happening overseas is pretty normal. We have sort of a cultural cringe. We like to forget about our own country because we're so isolated and small, and nothing much happens here, we naturally take interest in, I was interested in the Brexit referendum, and lots of other Australians were too. I have friends who flew to England for that referendum.
Oh, I would
to
have
take
loved to
part
have
in it.
done that.
Yeah. So it's we call it the cultural cringe, where our culture, there's a little bit of shallowness to it. Not a lot happens, both intellectually and artistically and politically. So we just take interest in what's happening in other countries. But I wouldn't say that there's antipathy. I think that there perhaps is a little bit of concern, but no anti-American sentiment, no.
Yeah, I'm not even sure that, what I was trying to get at there would necessarily be characterized as anti-American sentiment. It's just maybe a sense of, this maybe just kind of amorphous resentment, or not even quite resentment, but just, I don't know, frustration with the dominance of the United States politics to the degree that it dominates. And so it doesn't necessarily have to result in outright antipathy for
Yeah,
America as a notion, but just a generalized frustration with the status quo and the way things are.
yeah. That occurs in Australia whenever there is a debate about gun control in America. It's we have that issue on the news, and a lot of frustration is expressed by journalists and pundits and that kind, and the commentariat. But a lot of people like to feel smugly superior. Look at the unsophisticated. Look at Americans nominating Donald Trump, and aren't we so much more enlightened? We would never have a Donald Trump, that kind of thing. So I suppose there is a little bit of frustration, a little bit of opportunism, taking cheap shots, particularly around Donald Trump. But not me personally, but I have seen it in others.
Right. So I guess something that seems to have occurred to you over the course of your observations of the campaign has been how polarization has seemingly marched forward, and how that's kind of dynamics of the race. And I went back and read some of your writings for the past couple of years, and you sort of comment frequently on norms around social media and how maybe that is contributing to this broader polarization effect.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could, maybe apply those ideas that you had developed into the context of the U.S. campaign, and so to what extent do the incentives of the social media culture have they hastened polarization?
Oh yeah, definitely. I find the behavior of the American media to be highly frustrating. I noticed during the primaries there was just this hysterical response to Donald Trump, and I see the hysteria as being completely separate from the real criticisms that one can have of Donald Trump. But this mood affiliation that American journalists seem to have, like you get online and someone expresses some form of outrage, and then it just snowballs into this cascade of disapproval and hysteria. I think it's very self-reinforcing. And what I have seen in the media ecosystem, because I follow a lot of American journalists, I see how the same opinions get repeated over and over and over and over again. And I worry that what happens is if you're a journalist or some kind of opinion writer, and you're on a platform like Twitter, and you're trying to impress editors and get them to publish your work, the only feedback mechanisms you're going to pay attention to is whether they read you and retweet you online, and the real inputs regarding the accuracy of your work or how the general public view your work are going to be sidelined for these other feedback mechanisms. What your peers think of your work. I think what has been very damaging for media, both in Australia and America, anywhere, is the outsized influence that other journalists have on an individual's work.
Yes, good God.
And
I think that's so distortive, and it's so kind of perverted the incentive structure of how kind of modern media operates, because the social accolades you get are so immediate, right? And they're so unavoidable that even if you make an effort to resist them, there's no way you can fully do it because they're always in your face or on your phone, right? So that's why I think there needs to be special care taken to acknowledge that this is an issue in the way that people comport themselves. Obviously, there's no way to, like I said, avoid it completely, but there needs to be a self-awareness about its existence, at least, so that proper remedies can be taken to kind of manage it properly.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not something that just affects media. I've paid a lot of attention to bias and groupthink in psychology because I was a graduate student in psychology. And it happens anytime a consensus emerges that can't be tested with empirical evidence. So anytime there's a consensus that's just based on some kind of social norm, social interaction, and is not being tested, you'll get bubbles of groupthink, and it happens all the time. It happens all the time everywhere. I've noticed with the coverage of Trump, there's what I found frustrating is this. I mean, obviously his personality warrants commentary and criticism, but there hasn't been the kind of deeper analysis of what's going on politically that I would have liked to have seen. I mean, there's various, there's a new breed of op-ed about how it's the elites versus the losers of globalization, but apart from that, there isn't really that kind of that deeper analysis of what is going on politically, what shifts in politics does he represent. I think there's just this shallow analysis that he's just a populist demagogue and all of his followers are either losers or bigots. But yeah, I personally think there should be more analysis other than his impropriety,
Yeah. So no, and I share in that frustration, and I'm probably even more deeply immersed in it than you are, as an American citizen and as a journalist who tries to produce good political commentary and analysis and reporting. But it's just incredible to me that after all this time, after all the sound and the fury of the 2016 campaign, going back even to 2013. So the United States had such incredibly drawn-out presidential campaigns that the groundwork laid for them it starts long before the formal campaigns are even announced. And the formal campaigns are announced a year and a half ahead of time. So there's a shadow campaign, and then there's the formal campaign. And then you have the general election campaign. So all told, it ends up being like 2.5 or 3 years of just this stuff dominating everybody's consciousness, and people just get fatigued by it eventually. And compounding that fatigue is the fact that every single day isn't just an avalanche of Trump-related frenzy, right? I mean, he said,
Yeah, yeah,
and he knows this. I mean, he
yeah, yeah,
he uses it to his advantage, and it worked for a long time. And it seems doubtful that it'll work in terms of the final outcome, but it's still a possibility. I mean, I would say he probably has a 20 or 30% chance of winning, something like that. But he knows that
yeah,
people will hang on his every word, and it'll dominate the social media
yeah,
culture. That's why he's a very prolific tweeter, and he gets a lot of attention from it.
yeah,
Um, but it just seems like at this point, because everyone has been so consumed by Trump as a figure and a popular pop culture icon, and his personality and
mm,
his affect and his foibles,
yeah,
the referendum now, amazingly, is becoming, I mean, the election rather, is becoming a referendum on Trump's personal traits.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah,
you wouldn't know that
yeah,
that Hillary Clinton is running to she's running on basically on the record of the incumbent administration, of which she belongs to the same party. You wouldn't
yeah,
know that she's putting forward all these pretty dramatic proposals, especially with regard to foreign policy. No, the attention has been overwhelmingly on Trump as a personality.
yeah,
So that's what the elections are going to be a referendum on. Do you like Trump or do you not like Trump? Pretty much. I mean, that's not going to be how
yeah.
everybody perceives it, but that's just such a dominant narrative now, and that having become a dominant narrative to me is an indictment of the journalism culture in large part.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I do agree with that. Up to a point, because um, as you would know, it's really hard for whoever gets elected to actually pass policy. You've got to get both, in Australia we have the lower house and the upper house and the Senate. Whoever gets elected has to convince people not of his, both within his party and not of his party, to vote for legislation. And often it doesn't, policies or pieces of legislation don't get through. And I think one of the dangers of your long campaigns is that it encourages candidates to massively overpromise, and that inevitably means they will underdeliver whilst in office. And so personality is important, because we should accept that policy has to be sort of worked out while you're in office because of things like partisan gridlock and just the normal checks and balances that are in the system, the parliamentary or governmental system. But it's these long campaigns which are corrosive, because what are candidates going to do other than overpromise, right? So I guess what I'm saying is, I think personality is a legitimate thing to assess within a candidate, alongside policy and track record. But that I acknowledge that these long campaigns are, yeah.
Yeah, so
There.
just to linger on the point you made about groupthink and this psychological element
Mm,
of the media coverage. So when you're looking at U.S. journalists kind of grouping themselves on Twitter and in related spheres,
yeah,
this would include the journalists themselves, and then the pundits, which is a sort of, I guess, a related but kind of different class of individuals, and then you have people in the broader political space, so operatives and different kind of people in that vein. Um, how would you advise, if you could advise at all, how would you advise them to um, uh, evade these kinds of
bubbles.
bubbles or perverse incentives which kind of compel a a coalescence around one opinion or one viewpoint that is considered good with a capital G? I mean, are there any kind of like
Yeah,
practical methods they can employ to resist these forces?
I think taking interest in international politics, taking an interest in what's happening in other countries rather than just the parochial focus on what's happening inside America. I think that could do a lot. I mean, I noticed that the most shallow Australian journalists only look at Australia. They have no interest in anything that's happening in Europe, have no interest in anything that's happening in the US. So just taking a broader perspective, and there are different, I suppose if you're a journalist, you only really want to follow journalists, but there are lots of intelligent people involved in social media that have nothing to do with journalism. So there are scientists, even within the scientists on Twitter, there are the psychologists, there's the statisticians, there are all sorts of little communities that you can tap into, and they're completely separate from each other. And you can glean insights and just interesting points of view from all of them. But just getting out of that echo chamber is. But I suppose a lot of people don't realize that they're inside an echo chamber, and even if you're following a lot of journalists who are liberal and conservative, you might consider yourself not to be in an echo chamber because there's people of different political persuasions, but it's still the journalism or the media echo chamber, if that makes sense. And there's going to be a level of groupthink even amongst people of different political persuasions if they're in the same industry and if they have sort of the same peers and similar friendship groups and professional groups and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's one thing to diversify the people or accounts you follow on Twitter, and that's a minimal step to take. It's an important one, and you should do it if possible. But that can only be the first baby step, right? Because that's just one facet of what informs your worldview. I mean, so like you said, your peer group, and especially your social network, online and off. Go ahead.
A lot of what you're talking about is out of our control. So if you grow up, like my husband, for example, grew up in a wealthy suburb, went to a wealthy school, and is surrounded by peers of the same socioeconomic status, and then went into a professional job. And that's mostly of what he's been exposed to, apart from going to university in a regional centre. Whereas if you grow up in a blue-collar, working class or underclass kind of disadvantaged neighbourhood, and you go to school with very disadvantaged kids, and then you end up in university, and then you end up in a professional job, your worldview is going to be completely different from the kid who has only ever interacted with kids who have professional parents. And I think a lot of the social bubble that we find ourselves in is somewhat out of our control. We can try to go traveling, and but yeah.
Well, what's so frustrating to me often is that yes, it is to a large extent outside one's control as to what station in life one ends up inhabiting, right? I mean, you can't control your parents, you can't control where you were born, you can't control what happens throughout your childhood and teen years, for the most part. But then once you enter, so especially for a professional political analyst, right? Once you enter that stage of life, you do have control over with whom you interact and
Yeah.
who comprises your social network.
Yeah.
But there are lots of people whose day job is to analyze politics, who
Mm.
still, stay amongst people in their peer group almost entirely. Maybe they'll make a superficial attempt every now and then to like go to a diner and talk to a voter,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah. Yeah.
that doesn't really count. That's like an exotic expedition that you're taking every once in a while to like just prove that you're not totally insular.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but like,
Yeah.
this is just to say there are steps these people could theoretically take to
Mm.
kind of account for these blind spots that will inevitably develop if they stay in their rarefied domains, but they just choose not
Yeah.
to take them.
Yeah, so well, I don't have the answer to that. I don't know what makes people only want to hang out with other people who agree with them. But I do know that if you only hang out with people who agree with you, you become lazy and you don't develop your argumentation. You don't develop your arguments to be robust and rigorous. And but I don't know how to, if someone doesn't want to step outside of their bubble and doesn't want to engage with people who disagree with them, people who disagree in good faith, I don't know how that can be remedied. It's got to come from personal motivation. And I think from what I've seen amongst in Australian meters, there is no incentive to. There are plenty of incentives to suck up to people who are going to give you work. There aren't a terrible amount of incentives to talk to the public or engage with pockets of people who are underrepresented. So it's just having skewed incentives and an industry that is under commercial pressure, I would say, and that's the other thing about media, is that because revenues are declining, all platforms have to narrowcast, so they have to appeal to the tribe that is going to read them, and there's no incentive to broadcast anymore and to have that wide readership of people from all different walks of life and all different persuasions, and I don't see how that can be fixed.
Yeah, maybe it's just kind of a lost cause at this point, although I think there are kind of ways to fix it along the margins, right? I mean, you can't change you can't change the general direction that the ship is moving in,
Yeah.
but you can kind of like adjust its course slightly here and there, in a more in a better direction. But you mentioned that it's advisable, or it should be desirable, to expose yourself to people who have different views than yours and different life experiences. And and on Twitter, for example, it can be, in one sense, it can be a good way to hone your argumentation, in that you're constantly, or at least I am, constantly barraged with people who don't agree with me and want to challenge me on a fact or an argument or a logical step that I make, right? And most of the time, I'm happy to engage with them if they are engaging in good faith. But the complication of Twitter is that you don't always know when somebody's engaging in good faith, right? A lot of people are behind anonymous accounts and they just want to get a rise out of you, or they're trolling, or so the distinction between a good faith interlocutor and a bad faith interlocutor is not always obvious. So that's another way that social media can kind of throw a wrench into this kind of way of looking at things.
That's right. And one thing I have noticed, and it does, it's quite disquieting, really, is how much because your American media, just similar to Australian media, is tribal. So you've got liberal media and then conservative media, and it's disquieting how much bad faith there is. So there is, like, if someone wants to discredit, say you've got an argument as to why Hillary Clinton shouldn't have been the Democrat candidate, a response is, well, you can go and read about all of those scandals on Fox News or Breitbart, and it's the dismissal of differing viewpoints because they belong to this tribe, and this tribe is so biased that you can dismiss it out of hand. Does that make sense? Like that,
yeah, and
it's easier to dismiss arguments because of these, because the media has become so tribal. You can't get contesting viewpoints. You can't get the argument that Hillary is not the proper candidate for the Democrat Party because there is no media platform that is not part of a tribe, and if someone's of the other tribe, you can dismiss them out of hand.
And that's a classic logical fallacy, right? I mean, that's just a technical fallacy that you would be taught in Logic 101, which is to say, X is wrong because Y believes X. I mean, Y believing X doesn't ipso facto makes X wrong. You have to furnish reasons why X is wrong. But social media kind of amplifies this idea that if Y is bad with a capital B, then nobody can believe X because Y believes X. And you don't have to actually put forward any reasoning to establish why X is bad. And especially if you're getting likes and retweets by employing this fallacy, you're not going to necessarily conceive of it as a fallacy. You're going to conceive it as just a way to signal that you're in the right.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to your election, I have found it perplexing how any criticism of, for example, any criticism of Clinton is often viewed as endorsement of Trump. And I have to say that doesn't happen when we have election campaigns. Anyone running is heavily criticized, and it's not automatically seen as endorsement of the other candidate. So I found this you're either with us or you're against us really interesting to watch and quite concerning, because it's just something that does not happen here. Every candidate is thoroughly investigated and criticized, and it doesn't imply that you won't vote for them. Like you can vote for someone and heavily criticize them at the same time, or want them to be investigated. But I found this attitude towards, if you say anything critical of Clinton, therefore you must support Trump. I found that really bizarre.
Well, I mean, I think there's always an element of that in U.S. presidential elections. Like, this is only the second one that I've covered from a journalistic standpoint, so I don't have that long of a frame of reference. But I can remember even in 2012, which was milquetoast compared to this cycle, there'd be the same dynamic where if you made a criticism about Obama, it was seen as somehow helping Romney, who was this horrible menace and needed to be stopped, and the Republican Party was crazy, right? So Trump has kind of heightened that furor to an unprecedented degree, I think. So it really has made it so that any kind of criticism of Hillary is disingenuously depicted as a surreptitious effort to help Trump, and you get that all day, every day on Twitter from people who feel like they have the real scoop about what your true motivations are. I mean, so that's what I get constantly. I mean, it's always funny because it feels a little trivial and a little even narcissistic, possibly, to dwell on the dynamics of Twitter, but it is significant in a way because a lot of very influential people live on Twitter, and
Yeah. Yeah.
Twitter dictates
Yeah.
to a large degree how they perceive the world and how they tailor their political commentary and coverage. So in that sense, I think it is worth deciphering. But I get it constantly
Mm.
because in being a vocal critic of Hillary, which I have been for years now. I mean, so I was a supporter of
Mm.
Barack Obama when he ran against her in 2008.
Yeah.
Um, I was opposed to her when she was nominated to be the Secretary of State because I knew it would mean that the United
Yeah.
States engaged in many misadventures abroad, which sure enough ended up being the case. And then I opposed her against Sanders this year. But now that she's against Trump, any criticism leveled against her is interpreted by hordes of cynical people
Mm.
as a surefire sign that I am a secret Trump supporter. I cannot tell you how often
Yeah.
I get it. I'm almost numb to it at this point. But one
Right.
strategy they'll employ is that because I've placed something of an emphasis on reporting critically on the Clintons, so it's a plural because they're going to
Mm.
be a governing team,
Mm.
right? Um,
Mm.
so that itself is that itself is said to be sexist a lot because
Oh,
Hillary and Bill were a governing tandem
yeah.
in the 90s.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
ran they
Yeah.
ran as a two for the price of one duo.
Mm.
He's now her top surrogate, and she says he's going to have an explicit policy role, but speaking about them as a
Yeah.
unit is somehow sexist
Yeah.
and diminishes
Mm.
Hillary's agency, right? But
Yeah.
but one thing that I'll get all the time is that people who want to discredit me, right, will say that you
Yeah.
have gotten a lot of Trump followers supporting you and following you now, and it's true because I
Yeah.
focused on Clinton in the past couple of months. Unsurprisingly, a fair amount of Trump
Yeah.
supporters and right wing types probably have followed me on Twitter and engaged with me pretty regularly. So
Yeah.
that is cited as some kind of shameful mark on me, as if I could control who follows me on Twitter. Um, and it just seems like
Yeah.
it gives people this opening to engage in such cynical misinterpretation. And I don't know.
Yeah.
How do you look at that kind of thing?
Yeah. I don't know how to solve that problem either. When I first joined Twitter, I was back in 2013. I was quite vocal in criticizing sort of pop feminism, the kind of Jezebel type feminism that was popular. I don't know if it's still popular. I've tuned out of gender politics, but back then I was very critical of what I thought was this shallow, distorted version of feminism that was being popularized by these online blogs such as Jezebel and so on. And so lots of my followers are either men's rights activists or sympathizers or perhaps even, well, I don't know if pickup artists are still a thing, but of that kind of manosphere world. And I don't operate in that world, but a fair chunk of my followers either come from that online subculture or are sympathetic to it, and it doesn't bother me, to be honest. I think it does as long as your followers aren't actively trying to harm. With Milo Yiannopoulos, how some of his followers were actively trying to troll people that he was having arguments with or disagreed with. I think that's you're potentially culpable for that if you're a significant person and you have a lot of followers and going after someone else. But other than that, I don't see it as a problem.
Yeah, no, I don't see it as a problem either, but it's impossible to deny that it's used cynically to discredit people.
Well, I think that's I think it's like someone a bigot or a sexist or a racist, and just stopping at that. Jonathan Haidt had this essay in the American Interest a few weeks ago about the tension between globalism and this new authoritarianism that's coming up in European and American politics, or coming up all over the world. And he said that, you know, too often the analysis just stops. So if something's described as being racist, that's it. The analysis is over. But he points out that the analysis has to go deeper than that. We have to look at what political shifts are happening, what ideological shifts are occurring, rather than just calling people unsavory, full stop, leave it at that.
Yeah, because, you know, when that's all that you can, when that's the end of your argument, right? That means that you're not laying out the reasoning that led you to that belief. So you're not giving an opportunity for people with whom you disagree to follow your your logical kind of thought process. And then when they see that your thought process is sound, maybe they will come around to it, and maybe they will revise their own thinking. Whereas when your only strategy is to label them one thing or another that is supposedly bad, and to be clear, it is bad to be bigoted. It is bad to be sexist. But, you know, when you have nothing to offer but that, you know, dishonorable label, then you're kind of foreclosing on the possibility that people can look at things in a different way, by virtue of what you've put before them.
And Jonathan Haidt, who has studied political polarization, he is very good. I mean, it's his area of study, but he looks at how people who have different viewpoints, different political persuasions, just view the world differently and have different values. And so just putting derogatory labels on arguments or viewpoints that you don't like, that's not an analysis, that's prosecution. So someone like Haidt, who is a psychologist who studies this, will go in and analyze what is really going on. And there can be some deeply immoral and amoral sentiments and arguments and motivations, but you have to get at what that is, what's going on, and just being lazily just dismissing something that you disagree with a label, that's not it's rather complacent.
And you know, Hillary Clinton infamously did this herself when she lazily dismissed tens of millions of Americans by simply assigning them a derogatory label of deplorable, right? And so she, in classic Clintonian fashion, she sort of backtracked on it and lawyered her way out of it. But, you know, her intention at the time was clear, and she was engaging in just that. I mean, she was prosecuting people rather than attempting to reason with them or grok their motivations.
And if she was running against anyone other than Trump, I think that would have disqualified her. I think a few facts would disqualify her. I was talking to, going back to the deplorables, you cannot insult people into agreeing with you. And I think that's the thing that has shocked a lot of people around the world about this particular election, is how much those who support Clinton and those who think that Trump is dangerous or an existential threat have used this strategy of insulting anyone who might sympathize with Trump or Trump supporters, insulting them or attempting to shame them into voting for the other side. And it's the most counterproductive tactic in politics, imaginable. It's only because Trump is so consistently undisciplined and ignorant that he's likely going to lose the election. But if it was anyone else, that strategy of shaming people into voting for the right side, it wouldn't work, and it would have backfired.
Yeah, well, when Hillary rattled off that screed, she wasn't attempting to convince anyone. I mean, she said she did that at an audience of donors in Manhattan,
right?
And it was actually an LGBT donor, some kind of gala. So she was making these remarks for the gratification of people who already firmly agreed with her about the immorality of Trump supporters. She wasn't doing it as any kind of persuasion effort at all. It wasn't a campaign rally. It was at a fundraiser. So that kind of heightened the that to me heightened the how would I put it? It heightened the immorality of her doing that. I mean, because it was at this kind of conclave of high society, where she felt a little more free to engage in vituperation, right, about these people who are supposedly deplorable.
Yeah. Look, the fact that Clinton is running is the candidate and likely the next president is it's unimaginable from a Australian perspective. We in the news recently, one of our members of parliament had to resign because he had a $1,600 travel bill that was paid by a donor, a Chinese donor, and the $1,600 travel bill issue covered the news 24/7 for days until he resigned in shame. Right, the premier of the state that I live in, New South Wales, where Sydney is, he had to resign because he was given a bottle of wine from a donor and he didn't declare it.
That's unbelievable.
So we have this thing called in New South Wales, the Independent Commission Against Corruption, and politicians have to go and be scrutinized all the time, constantly. And I think, because we're a nanny state and the government is in our lives all the time, they have to be completely clean, like 100% cleaner than. And it's very much accepted here that even if there is the appearance of even if there's the appearance of a conflict of interest, that's enough. Yeah. You shouldn't be in public office, because it's the perception of the public that counts. So if the public cannot trust that you're in public office for the right reasons, not because you're power hungry, not because you might benefit financially, if the public cannot trust, then everything it doesn't work, right? And so
such a hilarious contrast, because there are literally billions of dollars that cannot be traced or accounted for by any kind of central authority, that are just sloshing around the American electoral system, with Hillary Clinton now being the largest beneficiary of this money. Trump is actually has a historic small dollar operation going, which is ironic in its own right because he's a billionaire. But he has nevertheless kind of mobilized this base of small donors who are giving him a lot of money, whereas Hillary is constantly jet setting to these very wealthy dinners at Beverly Hills or Martha's Vineyard or wherever else. When you say the appearance of impropriety in Australia would be a disqualifier in a sense, the appearance of impropriety is just embraced here. Obviously there's going to be obviously being in hock to a person who's given you and your foundation. So the Clinton Foundation has taken a staggering amount of money from many of the very same people who are now her campaign donors.
Mm.
So it's more than just an appearance of impropriety. It's known that there will be outsized access given to these people because while she was Secretary of State, Clinton Foundation donors, sure enough, despite her assurances to the contrary, got preferential treatment. So they used
Yeah.
their private so-called philanthropic giving to the Clinton Foundation to access preferred, you know, to access the State Department for various business-related reasons, right?
Yeah.
So that would be, I mean, if somebody, it's the governor of New South Wales, right? Or what's the title?
Premier. Yeah.
Yeah,
Premier.
the premier of New South Wales had to resign because of a bottle of wine, right? But
Yeah. It
Hillary Clinton in the United States,
was a good
she,
bottle, but
I'm sure it was fantastic. But Hillary Clinton, who pays for the wine at these fundraisers? I mean,
yeah, yeah,
how
yeah,
many bottles of
yeah,
wine have been drank at these various fundraisers that she's been at
yeah,
every other day?
yeah,
So it's just
yeah.
incredible. The contrast there is just unbelievable. Um, and actually, yeah, but the governor of the former governor of Virginia, I don't know if you follow this case at all, but the former governor of Virginia went on trial in an unprecedented prosecution because um, he had taken gifts from a big donor of his in Virginia. So he was the governor of Virginia from 2010 to 2014, and he got indicted and he was found guilty for basically public corruption because it was said that this wealthy businessman in Virginia, gave him golf memberships, and he took his wife on
Mm.
a spending spree, and he was found guilty. But then the Supreme Court just a couple months ago overturned the conviction, and they overturned the conviction on the ground that the quid pro quo is not sufficiently established. Right. So
Right. Yeah.
obviously,
No.
this
So.
businessman
Yeah.
got advantages because he was a friend of Bob McDonnell and so on and so forth. But
Yeah.
because couldn't like, and it's very hard to prove a quid pro quo because you can't like be in the mind of somebody
Yeah.
and say that, oh, he did this for
Yeah.
this reason. But it seems like in Australia the
Yeah.
standards for what constitutes ethical impropriety are a lot lower, right?
Yeah. So it doesn't. You don't have to prove quid pro quo. You just. But if there is the appearance of a conflict of interest, so if you're in public office, you should not have interests in any. You should not have any roles. Like you would not be able to have a role or an interest in a charity, a multi-million-dollar charity. That just would not happen. You wouldn't be allowed to be. You certainly would not be able to work in policy regarding foreign affairs and then have interest or even if it's at arm's length with a charity that collects money from sovereign nation states. That would just be completely, you couldn't do it. And no, yeah, you wouldn't. The various politicians that have had to resign here, so the MP who resigned over the travel bill, there was no discussion of quid pro quo. It was just that he accepted this money and he shouldn't have. He accepted it from a foreign sovereign state, and no one wants that kind of money in our political system, even if it's $1,600.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
so I saw that you, and we'll wrap up somewhat soon, but I saw that you mentioned
Yeah.
on Twitter that Australia has compulsory voting, right?
Yeah.
Um, and actually, conveniently enough, I just wrote a column for Vice this week on the various rationales that people level for why they will abstain from voting from this election, right? Um,
Yeah.
and one of the rationales is that you don't want to that by not voting you are declining to legitimize
Yeah.
the system which produced these two candidates, and
Mm.
by diminishing overall participation rates, you are therefore conferring a sense that there is this broad-based discontent with the state of affairs, right? And
Yeah.
it seems like in Australia, if it's a civil infraction, right, to not vote, um,
Mm.
seems like there would be a state penalty for exerting one's right to make that a statement of that kind. Um,
Yeah,
so how?
you don't get in fined for doing an informal vote. So plenty of people, if they're really disenchanted, just go in and write an insulting message on their ballot paper and stick it in the box, or they'll just put their ballot paper in blank, or yeah. So you get a fine if you don't rock up to the voting booth on the day, but you certainly don't get a fine for spoiling your ballot or handing in a blank ballot.
Yeah, but those people who
Yeah,
go in and just do a phony ballot, right? I mean, they are still
yeah,
they're still participating in the election, right? So the
yeah,
participation rate or the turnout rate is still going to be high because even though they kind of
yeah,
even though they spoiled their vote, they're still participants.
yeah,
Whereas one of the ideas here is that if you don't participate at all, and therefore you diminish the overall rate of turnout, that itself is
yeah,
a signal that there is something wrong with the way the system is operating.
yeah. Well, we count informal votes, so I'm not sure what it was at the last election, but informal votes have been rising in Australia, so there is growing disenchantment with the two-party system. So the votes are counted at least. The reason why we have compulsory voting is because when Australia started after we had a federation and they started elections back in the early 1900s, no one turned up. So they had to coerce people to show up, and it's stayed in place because it works. So you get less sort of special interest groups hijacking the political system for their own purposes, and you get much more representation for people who are socially disadvantaged and who don't have money to pour in to their favoured candidate, that kind of thing. So
Yeah,
it's worked for us historically. I don't know if it will continue forever, but it has served a purpose.
yeah, I can see the purpose it
Sure.
serves, but the issue in the United States, theoretically, if it were to implement it, excuse me,
Mm.
there are so many elections here. I mean, even in New York
Yeah.
State, this year alone, you had the
Mm.
presidential primary election, which was held in April. Then you had
Mm.
the congressional primary elections, which were held in June. Then you had the state primary elections, which were held in September, and now you'll have the general election held in November. So, are you going to have a compulsory? Are you going to compel people to vote in four separate elections in a year in New York? I don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah,
Maybe I mean it would
yeah,
be good to consolidate those elections, and people have been agitating for that in New York. Although the system in New York in
mm.
particular is very ossified because of the way that the party structure is here in particular.
Yeah,
Um, but the U.S. mean, because states run elections and localities run elections as well as and even in the federal government. I mean, the federal government doesn't is not the ones who runs the election. I mean, the states run it.
mm.
They just have like this.
Okay.
They have this kind of compact where
Mm.
they've agreed that their votes will all count toward the electoral college, and that will determine who is the president constitutionally.
Yeah,
Um, so I guess when you have a parliamentary system and things are sort of centralized in that way, it's a little more feasible to implement something like compulsory voting. But in America, things are so federalized and so dispersed.
yeah,
It's hard to see
yeah,
how that would work in practice.
yeah. And if I had a job where I had to do shift work or work on the weekends, there's no way I would take time off work to go and vote if I didn't feel very strongly about either candidate. There are lots of reasons why you wouldn't go and vote if it was not mandated or not enforced, and I can completely understand that.
Yeah, and I really do want to wrap up soon, but it occurred to me something
Mm.
I wanted to mention that you brought up, maybe like 20 minutes ago or so, which is, I asked you, how do you what are some ways you can kind of accommodate this tendency to engage in groupthink when you're in the journalism realm, right? So
Yeah.
one way you suggest is to place an emphasis on international politics in addition to your own domestic politics. But what occurred to me is that in the U.S., I mean, it's such a huge country, right? So 320 million people.
Yeah. Mm.
It's a full-time job to focus just on this presidential election, and even when you focus on it all day, every day, as I pretty much do,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
still can't
Yeah.
you still can't uh,
Get
uh,
across it all.
you still can't attend to every aspect of it, and then on top of that, so I've been driven crazy because I
Yeah.
would normally follow all the Senate elections, all the as many House elections
Yeah.
as possible, gubernatorial elections. So it's just a staggering amount going on that you can barely get a hold of most of it. So the idea that
Yeah.
I also then have to like follow Swedish, like
Yeah.
it doesn't make any sense. I mean, I also follow the Brexit vote, and I do for whatever reason just have an interest in UK politics in particular. So I have a pretty good sense of what goes on there at any given time,
Yeah.
especially with the Corbyn thing, and there were some Sanders analogies made, and then there's the Trump
Yeah.
and Nigel Farage connection. Um, and then the U.S. and the U.K. have a military alliance, so they were in Iraq with us and Afghanistan and so on and so forth, and as was Australia, I guess.
Mm.
But
and then you've got to go through all
crap.
of WikiLeaks.
Yeah, and then there's WikiLeaks, which you can only get. It's just there's so much. There's only so much time in a day, right? So I don't know
Yeah.
how to. I don't know how to implement that
Oh, well,
guidance.
yeah, you don't. I mean, being skeptical of the consensus is always a good start, but you don't want to turn into one of these people who are just reflexively contrarian in a sort of a vapid, shallow way. And there are plenty that, well, not plenty, but there are some people who are like that, who whatever everyone else is saying, I'll just say the opposite because that's my contrarian role. But I think in general, a good starting place is to be skeptical of a consensus, or at least apply some thought to something might be the consensus, and has this consensus been tested, and if it has been tested, how? Does that make sense? So if you're,
Yeah,
or is
no,
that just a bit abstract?
No, it makes sense. It's just and I think the funny thing, a lot of people in that bubble would probably agree with what you just said, right? I mean, so that they're not gonna like self-identify as members of this bubble, or people who are like helping to move along the engines of consensus. It's just that they're kind of their life experiences and their mode of thinking that kind of like put them in that box. So they have very little self-awareness. That's what I've been harping on. I mean, there's a very little self-awareness in this elite cohort, and that kind of brings me back to this point about the inability to follow foreign politics efficiently. It's just like the U.S. is so vast, not only in terms of land mass, but in terms of demographics, and there are all these amazing little subcultures. Like I was just at a Hindus for Trump thing a couple days ago. So there's and then I was at an Amish meeting in Pennsylvania, and then you go to Maine, and where I was recently, and there's this Franco-American little subculture, and so you could be a foreign correspondent within your own country. And I think people should do that to the best of their ability. Because that, I think, in itself, just diversifying your life experiences will inevitably, cause you to question the consensus, and not just from a contrarian standpoint, which I think you're right to point out that just being a contrarian and saying what the prevailing opinion is wrong just because it happens to be the prevailing opinion. Is not. I mean, that's fallacious in its own right. You have to come up with sound reasons. Why that are a product of like your genuine kind of inquiry.
Yeah, I think one thing I used to do, which I'm wary of doing anymore, is I would read journalists from one school of thought. So I used to read a lot of neoconservative type journalism, and I would see them making criticisms of journalists not in their school or of their ideological persuasion, and I would, they would make rational arguments and I would agree with it. But then when I became exposed to those other points of view, I realized it was not that simple. The arguments that I was formerly exposed to were overly simplistic. And so now I try and make a point of, if I read something that's critical, I'll go and read the primary source, and I might understand that the criticism is actually quite shallow. And one fun thing to do on Twitter is have a list where that certain journalists hate each other and sometimes get into fights, and to have them on the same list. So you're getting the different perspectives, and sometimes you can get the fights. It's actually quite fun, and it can remind you that there are these ideological enclaves.
Right.
Yeah,
that is fun.
Yeah,
it's just I see enough Twitter fights as it is without actively going out of my way to encounter them. That I don't know that I would implement that particular piece of advice, but I'm sure some might.
But I think what the point I'm trying to make is that there can be very serious journalists who have insightful things to say, who you agree with, like quite often, who disagree with other serious journalists who you also agree with. So just sort of.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, just cultivating your exposure to disagreements that are at that higher level, I think, is useful.
I don't know. My phone just went haywire for some reason.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
But yeah, so let's wrap up now. I mean, you could tell I'm an amateur at these sort of like pseudo interview things, because I didn't ask you to state anything about your background up front. So for the people who are very kindly watching live right now, just explain basically what you do in a journalistic sense, and the website that you run, and how people can kind of get and follow your stuff.
Yeah, so I'm not a journalist. I'm trained in psychology, but I edit.
You're a columnist or a writer, right? Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm not very prolific. My website is quillette.com, so it's QUILLETTE.com, and we mostly publish essays. A lot of them are long form, mostly from non-journalists, so academics that I know who work in psychology. There's quite a few of them, and the aim of it is to give a platform to people who, particularly academics, whose work covers taboo subjects, so stuff that is not embraced by the mainstream media because it touches on some taboo or another. So we published essays on stuff like eugenics, or I used to write on. I've written on neuroscience and sex differences, and we've got articles on realism in foreign policy, and stuff that is not necessarily just automatically embraced by mainstream outlets.
Yeah. Well, those are some heavy topics, so maybe people will go and seek them out at their leisure. Okay. Well, this was a very illuminating conversation. I thought hopefully people found it hopefully people enjoyed it, and hopefully you did as well to some extent.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Cheers. Bye.